you just have to take a different approach. And so the approach that is most popular now, they called orphan diseases. And so the strategy is to find something that has a similar action and study that. And the FDA actually facilitates it.
Howdy, and welcome back to the Idea to Impact podcast. Last week, you heard us talk to Dr. Thomas Kent from A&M's IBT campus. This week, on part 2 of his episode, we learn more about his experience really diving into and learning about how he's able to get his ideas to the market. And here's a hint, he's still working on it. It still hasn't happened yet. When you're dealing with drugs, things that are going to go into the human body, there is a little bit different of a process, and Dr. Kent goes into that today. So let's get started.
And so the approach that is most popular now is to do something that the FDA has also realized is a problem, is that diseases that don't affect a lot of people will never generate enough revenue to motivate, or even so that a company can afford to do the research, because they have to recoup that somewhere. And if there are only a few thousand people that have the disease, that's why you see, $1 million drugs when they first come out, because, there were 100 people, it might have cost $1 billion to make that.
Right.
Yeah.
So they called orphan diseases. And so the strategy is to find something that has a similar action and study that. And the FDA actually facilitates it by orphan drug designation. And so that's what we're taking. So we're taking a disease that actually affects 5,000 people, but involves similar mechanisms. That we've been able to find funding for. And then the way drug approval works is a physician can actually prescribe an approved drug for anything. I mean, if the FDA hasn't sanctioned it as an indication, you're obviously at some risk when you do that. Something goes wrong. But if you have a good reason to do it, and there's good studies, at least in the preclinical world, to suggest it would work, and it seems safe, then the hope is that people would get experience with these drugs enough to convince to do eventually a large study. So I can tell you in the disease we're dealing with, there's only 5,000 patients with it in the States, and there's at least 15 companies working on it.
Wow.
So they're all trying to do the same strategy with all different kinds of drugs, but they're all trying to do the same strategy, this orphan strategy.
Okay.
That's also good for the folks who have these kind of orphan diseases, and that they might not have any other hope at getting something cutting edge to help them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's, of course, the bottom line is that
Gotcha.
The orphans, and it's an orphan because nobody, there's nobody there to take care of them. So that's right. The term orphan comes from, there's just, they're out there, and nothing was being done, not nothing, but, nothing substantial was being done to help them. So you kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and that would be just an amazing accomplishment.
I have a question based on a comment you made a little while ago, and I think we just flew right by it. But you said about the lack of funding, or the problem that I'll go back. The funding problem, at least in the States. So that made me think that if there are other countries that are willing to fund the research where the U.S. companies perhaps aren't, what are some of the issues that someone in your position has to think through if they are approached by somebody not in the U.S., if they're approached by foreign sources of money? Because our listeners and our viewers are mostly researchers, and I'm sure there are more than a handful that are either came up against the same issue or are going to come up against the same issue down the road. How should they be thinking about this from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's ethical research done everywhere, and so in itself, being non-U.S. Is not. So there are a couple reasons why a non-U.S. may be more willing. For one, the drug approval process is different.
Okay.
In some countries, it's mostly is it safe, and then if it's safe, they kind of give you a little break in terms of efficacy. You have to, show it, right. but it's not quite as rigid. Now, the states develop, I don't know what the latest number is, but just a few years ago, it was 90%, somewhere in that area of new drugs. Right. So we're still the most innovative and the most, and our drugs are used everywhere, but there are countries that are certainly catching up and have had some pretty good breakthrough drugs. But then we would wonder, so let's say it got approved somewhere else. Well, it's going to be expensive. Does it work? You would still want to do the efficacy. So some countries are more willing to go with safety a little bit over efficacy. And within certain countries, the standards are different in terms of what it takes to get to a clinical trial. I know many, many years ago, I was approached, to give the materials for human trials way earlier than I would have felt comfortable. But I think even that has come under a lot of scrutiny. So I would think these days, even that doesn't happen very often. So I think, ethically, I don't see any problem in going with countries that have a good human subjects protection, good data, all of that. And you can find that all over. The other reason some countries, if they just happen to be high tech but smaller, they're just not going to necessarily take what the U.S. tells them. Okay, right. You guys don't want to fund it, but we might.
Right.
Yeah. And
thank you.
So you said that in some countries it's easier to get to clinical trials, and I assume you mean like with human subjects. So
right.
What is that? How has that impacted your, entrepreneurship journey? I mean, how difficult has it been to get clinical trials, and what do you do when you just have to, you're just waiting? What do you do?
Yeah, so it's maybe easier in some sense elsewhere, but in the end, it's not going to be that much easier to get it widely used. And the U.S. is still in many ways, the gold standard for where you need approval, although you certainly want worldwide approval. So we look everywhere. We look for investors in many different countries. They're all still looking to the U.S. for the main indications, but I think they're pretty willing to gamble. But we've not restricted ourselves in any way. So just tell you a little story. We when we made this, so since I've been to A&M, we've made two kind of big changes to our material. We were starting with this kind of buckyball type material. Well, it's been around obviously, but nobody knew about it other than in theory, that it actually occurred in nature. And it took this, basically simulating some outer space conditions to make it. And so even to think that the FDA would just accept that,
right,
maybe was a little optimistic. And so we recognize that fairly early and say, okay, can we make it from things they're more familiar with? And so the first thing was just out of plain coal.
Mm.
We get it out of coal. And it worked. It worked great.
Wow. And not in outer space, right? You're making it from coal on the earth, right?
Right. This
Okay.
graduate student would call up some, coal mining companies and
Okay.
we'll sell you 2 tons of it. Say, nice one.
Right.
So, finagled that out of a couple companies, and sure enough, it worked.
Wow.
So actually I met with one of the pharmacy folks at A&M was an FDA official, and we were talking about this. Said, it would be really good that activated charcoal is already a drug. It's used in poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
Can you make it from something they are even more familiar with? And sure enough, we're able to do so. So that's the first thing, is we're kind of speeding that. We're speeding, that part of it along. And then in the meantime, we also found that we could tweak it a little bit so it worked in this other kind of stroke called hemorrhage, the hemorrhagic, when it bursts. Mm-hmm. We added something that actually eats up some of the things that are released from the blood. And again, as a vascular neurologist, I'm familiar with the condition where little tiny microbleeds occur in people as they get older. Some genetic contribution, but it happens even without that. And it's associated with cognitive decline. Yeah. And so it's conceivable that it could prevent that. It could prevent that from happening. And so we started, we're aware that there's a huge interest in various parts of the country in anti-aging. I don't know if you've read about it, using young blood and, doing these. I mean, there's just this huge interest in a lot of the major entrepreneurs in this. And so we just kind of called them and said, we think we have a treatment for that. And that was our first foray into the investment world, that there might be an interest in broader. So if we can get through this initial, so you asked what kind of the funding strategy. So if we can get through this initial orphan, there may actually be, a lot of applications for them outside, even, beyond stroke. And in a way, these are tiny, tiny little strokes, but it's mostly that you just cognitive declines over time.
So, I mean, my kindergarten understanding of it is that people are living longer, and the longer you live, the more the warranty expires and stuff starts to leak out a little and break a little bit here and there, right? So you're going to need things that are going to be able to maybe go in and repair without necessarily people sticking stuff in you to do it. If you're able to do it from a chemical or from a pharmacological way. Would that be the same in other clots in the body, that if other clots were removed, do free radicals exist? And would this perhaps help that as well? Or are those just not as dangerous?
Happens everywhere.
Okay.
Happens everywhere. It happens with shock. It happens in transplants. Once the organ gets put in and blood comes back, I mean, it happens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, okay. It happens everywhere. And yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it in terms of a warranty. But I guess that's what insurance might be, maybe.
Well, my wife always says after I turned 40 and things started to break, she goes, I should have gotten the extended warranty on you.
Take it back. Take it back.
That's right.
Well, we kind of ticked 35 as, maybe we weren't meant to go much further than that.
Yeah, I concur. 35 was when I started having all of my back issues. So.
Yep. Well, welcome to extended warranty world.
Cartilage starts breaking down, and I mean.
Yeah, my vision has gotten worse. I cannot my eyes just get tired. It's like I reach a point of the day and it's like, no, we're not working anymore.
I remember that after 35, you get those little things like in your chest. You go, what's that? Oh my gosh, what is that?
Or you can't move because you slept wrong.
Right.
What is that?
I can't feel my arm. I've just been playing this game for 3 hours, but I can't feel my arm.
That's the look my chiropractor gives me every time I go in, and I say, Dr. Ben, I I'm having such pain
There
in
you
my
go.
arm. And he's like, well, when do you have the pain? I'm like, and I wake up in the morning. He's like, well, show me how you sleep. I sleep like
Right.
this.
Sleep on a rock when you're 18, right?
Yeah. Well, no, now I have to sleep on a rock.
That's the therapy, right?
Yeah.
The rock therapy.
Yeah. It's great. But
Right.
yeah,
So from the intellectual property side, I hear things from people who don't know what they're talking about that will make a statement like this. Getting into the type of drug market that you're breaking into, Tom, is just silly because you filed the patent and it takes 15 years or more before they're even going to have it on the market for humans, and you only have 20 years of protection with your patent. So you only got 4 or 5 years left. That's not really worth it. I'm assuming that's wrong. And how did you what tactics did you use, I guess, to be able to make it worth your while to make sure these patents are so valuable for your investors?
It's not wrong. I mean, there is a limit to what you get protection for, and it takes a long time. You try to get something submitted early, so you can publish, because in academia you still have to get grants. It's a real balancing act, how early to put something out, because then that limits how much time you eventually have. But if you can't get a grant if you haven't published, and so there is that strategy in the academic.
A timing game of some sort, right?
Timing game, exactly. And so there's that we play. So we probably are earlier maybe than if you didn't have an academic spin to this. We probably are putting things out maybe a little bit earlier. And then, that jeopardizes the amount of time you have. But there are ways to round that. And our strategy is we keep new things.
Gotcha.
Continue our research, like this modified molecule is actually now a provisional patent submitted from A&M.
And a new 20-year clock starts with that update. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So your claims, I mean, this is, it's not cheap to
right.
patent attorneys make sure your claims are solid and cover that. So there is, I think in the end, you'll get enough protection.
Okay.
If you're able to, do this kind of strategy.
Gotcha.
Did you say that you kind of, as you have your research and as you're working on it, you're kind of creating new uses for it or discovering new things, you keep filing patents on it? Is that correct?
That's correct. You keep it. It has to be substantially different enough that, and sometimes you discover it did something. We discovered something completely new and unexpected about it. But in the patent world, if it was happening and you didn't know about it, it's not going to be covered in your original. It's still going to be covered in your original patent, and you can't get a new one. So it gets fairly specific in terms of what kind of new things end up being patentable.
Is it just what the stuff might do as far as the application, or is it also something that's inherent to a property of the thing itself? And I'll give the example. You talked about buckyballs kind of being soccer balls. Mm-hmm. Well, what if you're able to do something and the buckyball now is smaller and it's more of a basketball or something like that? Maybe that's too similar. Maybe it's more of a pole vault stick or something. I don't know. Something that makes a property of it has changed. Do those things also usually count toward getting new patents or updated patents?
So that specific question, that I'm not obviously a patent attorney, so I don't know, but actually that occurs. They're now all different shapes. There's tubes, there's pole vaults. That may be actually, I think that's going to be the space ladder is going to be made out of these what are called carbon nanotubes. So you're just a visionary.
I went into the wrong field. I should have been in nanovascular technology, right? I clearly have a good understanding. So are those things that are the properties that do change about it?
I'm sure you could figure out a way to patent those kind of changes. I'm sure that's, you have to have a strategy and good advice, but I would be surprised if you couldn't. And in fact, our first patent is a variant of the original buckyballs. Gotcha. As a treatment, and it's been granted. And so,
here's an example. Okay.
an example of what you're saying. Yeah.
Mhm.
This is fascinating.
So I have a question. You said, you've had other inventions and from earlier in your career. So those inventions, they went through the commercialization process. Did you end up having that invention licensed out, or did you start a startup company? Did you do a spin out? What was that process?
So that's actually a different brief story that in those days, there was not much of a university push to commercialization.
Right.
In fact, I would say it was discouraged because it wasn't pure, it was, and there were even major institutions that their VPs of research were not encouraging this because of all the conflict of interest hassle. So these early inventions actually ended up not getting commercialized.
Wow.
It's a button now on the MRI machine. You push a button and you get this measurement.
Right.
But there wasn't much encouragement, and because of that, we had to be everything. We had to be the inventor, the salesman, the entrepreneur, we had to do it all. And it's only recently that I realized we don't have to do it all because now we get support.
Right.
But a lot of us in my era still think that you have to do it all because there wasn't that much encouragement. So, and I'm sure there were reasons for that. There probably were people that had, pretty outrageous conflicts of interest. I'm sure that, probably happened. But for the most part, this is a much better environment. This is a great environment for invention and real scrutiny to conflicts of interest.
So were this type of research and these inventions mostly coming out of private companies as opposed to coming out from the university then?
There was university, but some much more than others. Some were doing this much earlier than others. And they may have actually gotten a license on that imaging technique. I actually suspect somebody was able to do that by varying it enough that it became, but I think now, over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been much more support for this in the universities. So there's been a shift over time. Companies used to buy academic technology really early. I would say 20 years ago, the first animal experiment in stroke, I would have had some huge company just buy it and say, we'll take it from here.
Right.
And so you didn't have to get the funding to take it through all these steps that the FDA requires because companies, well, they were burned. They spent so much money on so many things that didn't work. When the buyouts come is now much later in the process. And so we're, with our partners, with universities, with, all the help we can get, we're the ones now finding the funding to get us to the point where you can convince somebody with the wherewithal to take it to the next level.
So
they're letting the mistakes. Good.
Is now the easier time, or was it much easier back then for you?
So one thing's easier. It's easier to get the university behind you. It's vastly harder to get the funding.
Okay.
Many more things die. Many more ideas die in this range between the idea and getting a company to license it out. There's a lot of words for this. The
Valley of Death.
Yeah, Valley of Death. What's the Bill Murray? What's the Lost in Translation?
Translation. Oh, yeah.
So you're translating an idea to human. Yeah, that's the.
Well, I'm assuming the big company is saying, okay, wait, I can let Tom take the risk. Exactly. And if it busts, I'm good. But if it works, I can come in and boom, right?
Right. Okay. Right. That's exact. And I'm sure you'll hear that from others in medicine. Yeah. And then the other thing is medicines are much harder than devices. Devices the FDA has given, you don't have to do these huge randomized trials with devices. They just you'd never recoup your money. Okay. And so you see a lot more in the Gulf Coast in terms of devices being developed, and much fewer medications. And yet the ultimate impact of a medicine is much greater.
Right.
There might be 10 different kinds of knee implants or 50 different kinds of tools and surgery or monitoring devices, things like that. But you can get it commercialized, and it's, value. So it's a great scientific value. But then in terms of the impact, a drug like, for something like stroke or that would ultimately have a greater impact. It's just so much harder to get through this funding cap.
Is that because medical devices are seen as having fewer side effects or fewer dangers to them, or?
I think it's a good recognition by the FDA that if your device, for example, is doing something very similar to a device that's out there, that need has already been proven. And if you improve on that, that's pretty much what you need to show is how you've improved on it. So, it's kind of this recognition that it's a different process. Now, if it's a totally new device for something totally new, you're going to have to prove safety.
Right.
But the burden is not so much in terms of efficacy.
Okay.
It's much more on the safety end. Now, that may not convince insurance companies to pay for it. So you're still going to ultimately do it, but you have a much easier, I think it is much easier route to commercialization. And that's how the Gulf Coast started. Gulf Coast started emphasizing devices, which was very smart to get into this world and learn who's out there to fund things and where the investors are and getting the lawyers up to speed. And, it was a good strategy.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying the Gulf Coast? Is that the company?
Texas Gulf Coast. Yeah, Texas.
Yeah. So the medical device community is kind of in this kind of Houston, Galveston stretch, right?
Yeah, and College Station. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening. This whole kind of area, Houston, the Texas Med Center has a whole device incubator. The engineering school is heavily involved with a lot of the hospitals in Houston.
Is that why J Labs, you think, is down here in Houston too? Okay.
I was just talking, I just had a call earlier with people that are with the, it's called ACT, it's the Accelerator for Cancer Therapeutics.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole kind of program for people who have these early spin-outs to help them get, up and off the ground. And they're based in Houston. Actually, I think they're based, they partner with J Labs.
Mm-hmm.
And
J Labs is expanding into medicines, which is great. And it's again, the ultimate impact is pretty big. And of course, cancer is exploding with immune therapies and all that.
I got to go to J Labs last summer. We did some interviews with some of the companies that had been winners at the Texas New Ventures competition.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got to go to J Labs and just how neat that facility is. And I think the group we were looking at, they had built some sort of device that goes kind of into your spine and lets the doctor know when you're feeling pain or something incredible like that. But they're really doing some fun things and down there, and it's kind of cool to see technology like that before anybody else gets to see that.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Before the world even hears about it.
So you've been doing this since what, mid 80s, early 80s, Tom? Is that about right?
No, late 80s.
Late 80s. Sorry. I'm sorry. It was because there's a huge difference.
Thank you. I agree with that.
I guess my point is, what are the one or two things? Maybe it's just one thing that if you had to go back, in the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure phone booth to the late 80s and tell young Tom, hey, do this differently when you're dealing with your getting from idea to impact journey, when you're on that journey, or, watch out for this, or that pitfall is going to be there. What would you tell yourself?
Well, I think that, and I've thought about that, and what I really would have done is to be a better salesman.
Okay.
And, sort of the Elon Musk of medicine. And you see how critical selling your ideas are. We in academics, we're sort of low key about it. I mean, we have to convince our peers, but we convince them in a low key way. We don't use words like remarkable and breakthrough. And, in fact, we get kind of,
Right.
So, and then, neurologists are not known for their vivaciousness either. So, if there was something that I would do differently, because there have been several of these kinds of things that I saw ultimately after many, many years being incorporated into practice. So it's really rewarding. But could it have been sooner? Could it have been more widespread? If little more salesmanship, I think. Not to be shy about that.
Because I know that some of the things that we support, Beth, and that others at Texas A&M actually spend a lot of their time putting together, are events that try to get people to pitch better, that try to get them to be better salesmen of ideas, especially to investors. I mean, that's kind of the focus. But I'm sure there are other groups and stakeholders that you're going to want to sell to. And I mean, it's encouraging to hear from you that is a need. That's a need in the academic space, to be able to to either learn those skills or to hone those skills, so that you can ultimately be successful in getting your idea out there, right?
I can't tell you how important that is. That's
okay.
Not our nature. So there's sort of two things that are on our nature. That's one.
Okay.
And then the other is we don't stop. We just keep studying something.
Right.
And so the big lesson that I learned is, at some point, if you're going to commercialize this, you have to stop. And that's not in our nature either. And I learned that over many, many years. So, a good example. How would a scientist ever publish a paper with as many bugs as your average computer update or your phone update, right? You would be run out of the business, right?
Right.
But these are, the wealthiest, largest companies in the world, and they do it. And they do it because that's a business model. Okay, we'll put it out there, then we'll fix it, but we got to get it out there. And that's, I can hear somebody giving a talk and talk about wanting to translate it, and you can sense this, this just isn't going to happen unless this person makes this huge mental shift.
Right.
From perfecting it to, all right, let's put it in someone else's hands now to get out there. And you never compromise safety with therapies. It's not so much safety. It's when do you stop improving this for the commercial part? So those are, I think, the two big academic things that, if somebody is going into it, maybe, incorporating that into their thinking, I think would be helpful.
I like that. Making it commercially successful versus perfecting it. Commercializing versus perfecting.
How long did it take you to get that? Because I feel like as academics, we have a hard time not having perfection, and we want it to be perfect before we get something out there.
Right. It took a really long time, and it took a really hard conversation with a very aggressive investor.
Ah, nice.
Yeah, he just sat me down and just explained, this is the world, and this is the world that you're in now. And if you're comfortable with that, go for it. And of course, it never compromise safety ever. That's still got to be 100%. But is it the best or the most perfect form of this thing? That's, I think, something that you can definitely see may not need to happen to create a treatment.
There might be something that, where the science meets art, when it has to be reduced into something physical, whether it be a drug or whether it be a device. And I'm reminded, I used to be a musician before I was a lawyer and a political scientist, but we started out with 4-track recorders, and then 8-track, and then eventually there was 96-track. Now it's digital, and you can have as many tracks as you want. There's a point where, you don't need to produce this anymore, right? The song is good enough. But wait, I can tweak this little thing over here. No, it's if you will, commercially viable. The song is good enough. The art is good enough. And if you keep trying to perfect it, you're either going to ruin it or you're never going to get it out there. And great, you can listen to it in your garage if you want, but it's not going to have an impact on you out there. And so you're right. Does the drum beat match with the other rhythm sections? It has to, or else it's not going to be viable. It's like the safety thing, right? Certain things have to matter. The rest of them, I would assume that actually is more of an art than a science, to know when to stop. when do you know it's safe enough, good enough, let's move out? That might be hard.
I don't think there's a absolute right answer.
Right.
I think, in retrospect,
Mm-hmm.
You'll find out in retrospect that we waited too long or we
Right.
too early, but you just have to do your best. And I'm sure there's some luck of the draw, some luck. So you have these people in the music world too, huh? Same kind of.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a. So I think there are people like I don't know, theoretical scientists who get it to where it works in theory and it is kind of done. But then when you're putting anything into the real world, there's always a difference between this and the platonic form of it in your mind. And you're constantly trying to get it toward that platonic form, even if it's a song or a painting, right? Or a building, maybe, like if you're an architect or something like that.
Mhm.
Yes, there are the people that, no, it doesn't sound like it does in my head. I need to keep tweaking it.
Mhm.
And then there's the A&R guy at the label that goes, no, it's good enough.
This
Get
is
it out
it.
there.
You've had one day. That's it.
That's right. That's right.
A really good analogy, Jack. It's a really good way to put it.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Kent, what are your next steps in your invention? And then, let us know what are you up to next?
Yeah. So we have a pretty clear vision. We've got two indications. One's an orphan, and one's kind of an easier one, but much more common. We're have target to form a company around this specific one of these specific indications. Should happen by the end of the year is the hope, and it's this remarkable potential, and we'll hope we can realize it.
And so just because I'm curious, you're working with the Tech Transfer Office, so Innovation Partners, on this invention. At what point when did you submit your disclosure form for that invention? I'm asking just because I did a training video earlier on how to fill out the disclosure form, so I'm just curious. At what point did you start engaging with the Tech Transfer Office on this invention?
Yeah, so really early. We got some pretty convincing data on this new form and new mechanism, and engaged really early, and what we were hoping for is that whole process could be vetted and completed so that we could meet a grant cycle and a publication cycle. And so that's why we did this early, because that's kind of the driver of it.
Yeah.
But then also knowing, okay, once it's out, we just have to be ready.
Yeah.
We can't have a lot of loose ends. And so that's just an intense amount of work in the lab. I mean, people are working just really, really hard prior to this disclosure.
Right, because if you apply for a grant to help with this invention and you get that grant, those abstracts where you're discussing your invention are made public, right? So that would be like a public disclosure. Yeah.
Right. And that's, months later. I mean, you probably got 9 months just for that, assuming it gets funded. But unless it's a business grant, you won't get your grant without published.
Yeah.
Right.
So you do it kind of on what money you have, what funding you have. And then you write the grant, but you're aware that that's the ticking clock right there. You're right, is that public abstract. So you either keep it out of the public abstract, which is one strategy, and it's a good one. It's to keep the specific, proprietary stuff out of that abstract. Or you really believe you're going to be ready to go at that point.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very strategic.
Right.
Yeah.
It's been fascinating. I've learned so much. Thank you so much. Thanks for spending so much time with us.
Well, I appreciate it too. And I learned as well. And thank you for what you do. I think it's a really important contribution.
Thanks.
This has been very exciting. So again, like Jack said, thank you for joining us. Thank you for schooling us on
Yes.
vascular neurology, something I did not know anything about.
You're a good teacher. You're a good
Yeah.
teacher. Yeah.
Very good teacher. And so we are lucky to have you here at A&M. You obviously love teaching and love researching. And if you can explain to Jack and I in kindergarten terms
Right.
what vascular neurology is, then, you can teach anybody.
Okay.
But join us next week or next time on the Idea to Impact podcast, where we will continue to talk to faculty and inventors and entrepreneurs and learn all about their journeys from idea to impact. See you next time.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.